From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Donald Trump rules out another debate against Kamala Harris, which means voters might go to the polls in November with many questions still unanswered, including how each of these candidates would act around the world as America's commander-in-chief. Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We're joined today by my colleagues, Kate Batchelder Odell and Elliot Kaufman. The debate about debates is back started again after what was perceived by many analysts as a victory this week. Kamala Harris at a campaign rally in Charlotte on Thursday said, "I believe we owe it to the voters to have another debate because this election and what is at stake could not be more important." Donald Trump, on the other hand, in Tucson on Thursday said, "We've done 2 debates, and because they were successful, there will be no third debate." And Trump, of course, is counting as the first debate his knockout blow against President Biden earlier this summer. The frustration for voters, though, is in trying to predict how each of them would govern, and one place that might be harder even than the others is in foreign policy. The commander-in-chief has wide discretion to act in the nation's interest. In some years, there have been presidential debates devoted specifically, entirely, to foreign policy, including in 2012, the third debate between President Obama and Mitt Romney, famous now for Obama's remark that the Cold War is over, so quit obsessing about Russia, the 1980s called, and they want their foreign policy back, a comment that has not aged very well. Kate, let's take a tour today of the world's hot spots, starting in Europe and in Russia. I think this came up a little bit at the debate between Trump and Kamala Harris on Tuesday, though to my mind, with not the clarity that voters deserve here. I think Kamala Harris owns President Biden's support for Ukraine, but also his slowness in giving them the material they need to really push back Russia's advances. On the other hand, it's not clear how President Trump plans to end this war, as he says, even before he is supposed to take office. And let's listen to a clip of J.D. Vance, his running mate this week, on the Sean Ryan show, trying to explain what that might look like.
Ukraine wants this war to end. Europe, which, by the way, has underfunded this war while American taxpayers have been very generous to the Ukrainians, the Europeans want this war to end because it's jacking up their energy prices. So I think what this looks like is Trump sits down, he says to the Russians, the Ukrainians, the Europeans, you guys need to figure out what does a peaceful settlement look like. And what it probably looks like is something like the current line of demarcation between Russia and Ukraine. That becomes like a demilitarized zone. It's heavily fortified so the Russians don't invade again. Ukraine remains its independent sovereignty. Russia gets the guarantee of neutrality from Ukraine. It doesn't join NATO. It doesn't join, some of these sort of allied institutions. And I think that's ultimately what this looks like.
Kate, how do you read this and these 2 potential worlds that are in front of voters? One where Kamala Harris is making the calls on Ukraine in 2025 and beyond, and one where it's Donald Trump.
Well, I think you have to start by acknowledging some of the compasses are out of whack, because traditionally you'd be hearing Republicans in the tradition of the Reagan doctrine from the 1980s having a stiffer policy on Ukraine where they want the U.S. interest to prevail for Ukraine to win, to give them more weapons, to give them more support. And now you have a kind of inversion of that where that's the Biden-Harris, I will call it their pose, since to your point about how slow and halting and anxious about every weapon system that they've given to Ukraine, that's not a fair description of their policy. But now I think what Vance here is describing is, first of all, more detail than Trump has given on his thinking on Ukraine, which has been exclusively to say he'd settle it in 24 hours. But the Vance solution is striking because, first of all, it would give Putin the 20% of the country that he's currently occupying. The neutrality conceit, I think, makes no sense because it would essentially allow Putin to regroup his military and economic power and restart this fight in Ukraine on his own terms and with the confidence that NATO will not intervene on Ukraine's behalf. So there's nothing more sophisticated than just giving Ukraine to Russia on the installment plan under this conception of a deal here. So Trump has also said, I'm going to negotiate, but if Putin won't negotiate, I will give Ukraine even more weapons. I'm paraphrasing there. But there is, I think, some hope that perhaps he comes to a better position on Ukraine than he's currently articulated. And the thing is, you have to compare this against what the Harris administration would do. And to your point about owning Biden's record, the Biden administration is now debating allowing Ukraine to use some Western weapons on targets inside Russia, but not the long-range army missiles known as ATACMS. And this is only after weeks of begging from some congressional Republicans and others and Ukraine, and only after Russia has moved a lot of its assets a little bit further back from the border to protect its sanctuary deep within its own territory. So voters also have to price the risk that what Harris does is continue more of this muddle where Ukraine doesn't have a strategy, an ability to get more of its territory back and simply loses the war more slowly. So I think what should alarm voters is that we haven't heard a credible plan from either side on how to end this war in a way that favors the United States.
I'll add a couple pieces of news here this week as Kate was describing this decision about whether to lift restrictions on Ukraine's use of missiles to hit targets in Russian territory. Here's the top of a Reuters story. Joe Biden asked whether the U.S. would lift those restrictions, so the administration was, quote, working that out now. And then a day later, you have the Kremlin warning of escalation, claiming that this would be direct involvement by the U.S. and Europe in the war and would trigger a response from Moscow. And to the point that Kate is making about lack of clarity, lack of detailed plans here from both the Trump and Harris camps, it's not clear to me, at least, how either of them would respond to those kinds of threats by Russia. And then to the argument that J.D. Vance is making that the path here might look like freezing the current lines of demarcation and making that a demilitarized zone. Elliot, that strikes me as not a workable plan, a workable solution. One reason that I think Ukrainians defenders don't want to do that is they would fear that Putin would just bide his time then to build up more forces. But two, this is complicated by the facts on the ground, because recall that the Ukrainians have made a push now into Russian territory in the Kursk region and are controlling something like 500 square miles of Russian sovereign territory. And so is J.D. Vance talking about freezing those lines of demarcation and leaving Ukraine in control of Russian territory with some kind of demilitarized zone? It seems like a half-baked idea to me.
Once we start making concessions on behalf of the Ukrainians, why should we stop? Presumably, they could say you have to leave there too. I think the question to ask here is, why are Donald Trump and J.D. Vance allowing Biden and Harris to position themselves as the only ones who, think Ukraine has a better case in this war than Russia does? It seems like a pretty easy position. You're not going out on a limb here to say it's not great when Russia invades a free nation on its border. It doesn't cost you much to say that. But because they won't say it, and because they come up with these schemes to sort of dismember Ukraine, undercut it in negotiations, they let Biden and Harris get away with pretending that they've been huge defenders of Ukraine. Trump could easily make a case that he has been far tougher on Russia than Biden or Harris have ever been. It was Biden who said we would allow Russia a small incursion in Ukraine. That would be okay. That was a ridiculous sort of collapse in deterrence there. There was no reason for that sort of thing. From there, delaying weapons, delaying how Ukraine could use those weapons. At the very start of Russia's invasion, Biden offered President Zelensky of Ukraine a trip out of there, abandoning the country. They were ready to give it up, in a sense. So Trump doesn't need to be positioning himself opposite and saying that he would be even less supportive of Ukraine than Biden has, and to connect that to Kamala Harris, I mean, ask yourself this. Has she ever separated herself from President Biden's stance to argue that he should do more for Ukraine? When has she said that? When has she made an argument saying, send the weapons, in the way that she did differentiate herself, for instance, on Israel by being more vocal about calling for a ceasefire immediately, a ceasefire sooner than the president did. On Ukraine, she has never argued that, and yet she's being allowed to present herself as a champion of Ukrainian freedom.